Sections. The sun was low and red when Thomas Garrett rode the fence line back toward his ranch, the October light painting the scrub grass copper and gold. The air was dry and cold together, the way it got in the high country when summer finally let go. He'd been out since dawn, mending wire where cattle had pushed through, his hands stiff with cold and his shoulders aching from the work. The horse beneath him, a gray mare named Ash, picked her way over the rocky ground with the easy patience of an animal that knew the way home as well as he did. Thomas was a man built for this land, broad through the shoulders, weathered dark by sun and wind, with hands that were more scar than smooth skin. He was 42 years old and looked older. His face was lined deep around the eyes and mouth, and his hair, what showed beneath his hat, was more gray than brown now. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who'd learned that wasted motion was wasted energy, and energy was the only currency that mattered out here. Sections, he'd inherited this ranch from his father 8 years ago, and he'd worked it alone ever since. 200 acres of hard country that gave up grass and water grudgingly, that required constant attention and offered no forgiveness for mistakes. He kept 20 head of cattle, a few chickens, and Ash. That was the extent of his world. He rode into town once a month for supplies, spoke to the storekeeper just enough to conduct business, and rode back out. He had no friends. He wanted none. Many sections. The ranch house came into view as he crested the last rise, a low structure of weathered wood and stone with a sagging porch and a chimney that listed slightly to the east. It sat in a shallow bowl of land with the barn and corral behind it, and a dry creek bed that ran water only 3 months of the year, cutting through the property to the south. It was not a beautiful place. It was functional. It kept the wind out and the heat in, and that was all Thomas asked of it. 4. He was still a quarter-mile out when he smelled it. 4. Thomas pulled Ash to a stop and sat very still in the saddle. He lifted his head slightly, testing the air like an animal scenting danger. The wind was coming from the direction of the house, carrying with it a smell that hit him like a physical blow. Pfashern cooking. These sections. Not the smell of his own rough meals, beans heated over a fire, jerky chewed cold, bread gone stale. This was something else entirely. This was onions and peppers, and something rich and warm that made his mouth water and his chest tighten at the same time. This was the smell of a kitchen where someone cared about the food they made. This was the smell of a home. He hadn't smelled anything like it in 6 years. Thomas touched his heels to Ash's flanks and rode down the slope faster than was safe, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the ride. As he got closer, he saw smoke rising from his chimney, thin and gray and steady. Someone had built a fire in his stove. Someone was in his house. He dismounted in the yard and stood for a moment with Ash's reins in his hand, staring at his own front door. The smell was stronger here, rich and complex, and underneath it he caught the scent of wood smoke and something green and fresh. His dog, a big German shepherd named Flint, should have been barking by now. Flint always barked when Thomas came home, but the yard was silent except for the wind. Thomas tied Ash to the porch rail and climbed the 3 steps to his door. His hand went to the revolver on his hip out of instinct, but he didn't draw it. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Pervor. The warmth hit him first. His house was warm. The stove was burning hot and steady, the way it should be burned, but the way he never bothered to burn it for just himself. The main room was small, a kitchen area along one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a fireplace on the far wall with his bedroll on the floor beside it. Everything looked the same as when he'd left it that morning, except for 3 things. Parferon. There was a woman standing at his stove. Parferon. There was food cooking in his pots. Parferon. And Flint was lying at her feet. Parferon. The woman turned when the door opened, and Thomas got his first clear look at her. She was small and dark-haired, maybe 30 years old, with brown skin and black eyes that watched him with a stillness that was more wariness than fear. She wore a long skirt that had once been bright blue, but was now faded and dusty, and a white blouse with embroidery around the collar that was coming loose in places. Her hair was pulled back in a braid that hung down her back, and her hands, he noticed, were red and rough from work. She didn't speak. She just stood there with a wooden spoon in one hand and watched him. Flint lifted his head and thumped his tail once against the floor, then put his head back down on his paws. The dog didn't even stand up. Sections. Thomas stared at her. He stared at Flint. He looked at the pots on the stove and the smell that filled his house, and the warmth, and the fact that this woman, this stranger, was standing in his kitchen cooking his food on his stove with his dog lying at her feet like she belonged here. Barbara, who are you? His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw from a day of not using it. Barbara. She didn't answer. She just looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, and he realized with a jolt that she probably didn't understand him. He tried again, slower. Who are you? How did you get here? Poor. Still nothing, but she made a small gesture with the spoon toward the table, where he now saw a plate had been set. One plate, one fork, a cup beside it. She'd set a place for him. Poor. Thomas took off his hat and stood there, turning it in his hands like a fool. He didn't know what to do. He should tell her to leave. He should ask her where she came from. He should do something other than stand here staring while his stomach growled at the smell of whatever she was cooking. Before Ver. The woman turned back to the stove and stirred something in the largest pot. Steam rose up around her face, and she leaned back slightly from the heat. She moved with the easy competence of someone who'd spent a lifetime at a stove, her hands quick and sure. She tasted whatever was in the pot, considered, then reached for a small cloth bag on the counter and added a pinch of something Thomas couldn't identify. The smell intensified. Ma'am, he tried again. I need to know who you are. She glanced at him over her shoulder and then pointed at the table again. The message was clear. Sit down. Eat. Questions later. Sections. Thomas didn't sit down. He walked slowly across the room, giving her space, and looked at what she was cooking. There were 3 pots on the stove. The largest held some kind of stew with chunks of meat and vegetables in a dark red sauce. The second held beans. The third held rice. On the counter beside the stove, he saw a stack of thin, round flatbreads, still warm, and a small bowl of chopped green herbs. Parfour. Where did you get this food? He knew every item in his pantry. He hadn't had rice in months. He'd never had whatever spices she was using. Pie-for. The woman reached under the counter and pulled out a cloth bundle, and she untied it and showed him dried chilies, a small paper packet of rice, a twist of paper that smelled like cumin when she opened it, a few wrinkled limes. Her supplies. She'd brought them with her. Parbrower. Thomas looked from the bundle to her face. You walked here, carrying that? She didn't answer, but he saw her eyes flick toward the door and then back to him. Yes, she'd walked. From where, he couldn't begin to guess. The nearest town was 15 miles south. The nearest ranch was 8 miles east. There was nothing to the north or west but empty country for 50 miles. Bipurbamar, he should send her away. That was the sensible thing. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know what she wanted or why she was here. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't do it. It was getting dark. It was cold. And she'd walked here from somewhere carrying a bundle of food, and she'd built a fire in his stove and cooked a meal, and his dog was lying at her feet like she was the most natural thing in the world. All right, he heard himself say it. All right, you can stay tonight, but tomorrow we figure this out. Pay for effort. She nodded once, a quick dip of her chin, and turned back to the stove. She ladled stew into a bowl and placed it on the table, then added a scoop of rice and beans beside it. She set one of the flatbreads on the edge of the plate and stepped back, waiting. Parfour. Thomas washed his hands in the basin by the door and sat down at his own table, feeling like a stranger in his own house. He picked up the fork and took a bite of the stew, and sections. The taste exploded across his tongue, rich and complex, and layered in a way he'd forgotten food could be. There was heat from the chilies, but it wasn't just heat. There was depth underneath it, a warmth that spread through his chest. The meat was so tender, it fell apart under his fork. The vegetables were perfectly cooked. He took another bite and then another, and realized he was eating like a starving man. The woman watched him for a moment, and then, apparently satisfied, she took a bowl for herself and sat down in the other chair. She ate quietly, her eyes on her food, giving him space. Parfour. They ate in silence. Thomas finished his bowl, and she stood immediately and refilled it without asking. He didn't protest. He ate the second bowl slower, tasting it this time instead of devouring it. When he was done, he sat back in his chair and looked at her. Parfour. That was the best meal I've had in 6 years, he said. It came out quiet, almost against his will. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw something other than wariness in her eyes. She smiled, just a little, and ducked her head. That night, Thomas gave her his bedroll and slept in the barn. It wasn't charity, he told himself. It was decency. You didn't make a woman sleep in the barn. That was all it was. But when he lay down in the hay, with his coat pulled around him, and Flint pressed against his side for warmth, he could still smell the food she'd cooked. And for the first time in 6 years, his house had felt like something other than a place to sleep between days of work. Parfour. He didn't sleep well. He kept thinking about the morning, and about what he'd say, about how he'd find out where she came from and how to get her back there. But when dawn came and he walked back to the house, he found her already awake. She'd built up the fire and made coffee, and there were eggs frying in his pan and more of those flatbreads warming on the stove. Parfour. She handed him a cup of coffee without a word. He took it and stood there drinking it while she finished cooking. The coffee was strong and good, and she'd sweetened it with something he couldn't identify. I need to know your story, he said finally. I need to know how you got here. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she walked to the corner where she'd left a small bundle wrapped in a torn blanket. She brought it to the table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a collection of objects that told him more than words could have. Sections a small silver cross on a broken chain. A faded photograph of a man and woman standing in front of a white church. A child's shoe, tiny and worn. A letter written in Spanish that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases were starting to tear. She touched the photograph with one finger and then pointed to herself. Then she touched the man in the photograph and made a gesture Thomas understood. Gone. Dead. She touched the child's shoe, and her face went very still, and he knew without being told that the child was gone, too. Parfour. She picked up the letter and held it out to him. Thomas took it, but he couldn't read Spanish beyond a few words. He recognized norte and trabajo and familia, but the rest was beyond him. She saw his confusion and took the letter back. She pointed north, then made a walking gesture with her fingers. She'd been traveling north, looking for work, maybe, or family. "You got lost," Thomas said. She shook her head. She pointed east toward where the town lay, and her face hardened. She made a gesture that was unmistakable. Men, many of them cruel. She'd gone to the town and something bad had happened, so she'd walked away into the empty country, and she'd found his ranch. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew the men in town. He knew how they talked about Mexican women, about foreigners, about anyone who didn't look like them or talk like them. He could imagine exactly what had happened when she'd walked into town alone. "They hurt you." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Not hurt, but frightened, threatened, driven out. And you walked here." She nodded. Thomas looked down at the objects on his table, the remnants of a life that had been torn apart. A dead husband, a dead child, a long journey north to escape whatever had taken them from her, and then more cruelty when she'd finally arrived. Pearl. He should still send her away. That was the smart thing, the safe thing, but when he opened his mouth to say it, different words came out. "You can stay, for a while, until you figure out where you're going next." She looked at him with those steady dark eyes and nodded once. Then she turned back to the stove and served him eggs and flatbread, and he sat down at his table and ate breakfast with a stranger, and tried not to think about how right it felt to have another person in his house, with sections. The days developed a rhythm. Thomas worked the ranch and she worked the house. He didn't ask her to. He came in from mending fence the second day and found his clothes washed and hung on a line she'd strung between two posts. The third day, he found the floor swept and the windows cleaned and the stove scrubbed until it shone. The fourth day, she'd organized his pantry and found the bag of flour he'd forgotten about, and there was fresh bread cooling on the counter when he came in. For she moved through his space like water, finding the gaps and filling them without disturbing anything else. She didn't touch his personal things. She didn't rearrange his tools. She just made everything cleaner, more organized, more functional, and she cooked. Every night there was food that made his mouth water and filled his house with smells he'd thought he'd never experience again. War. He tried to pay her back in the only way he knew how. On the fifth day, he left a pair of boots outside her door, good leather boots that had belonged to his mother and had been sitting in a trunk for years. They were too small for him and too good to throw away. She needed them more than the trunk did. The next morning the boots were gone, and she was wearing them. She didn't thank him with words, but she looked at him across the breakfast table and nodded, and he nodded back, and that was enough. On the seventh day he came in from the north pasture and found her in the yard behind the house, kneeling in the dirt. She'd cleared a patch of ground about 10 feet square and was turning the soil with a hand trowel she must have found in the barn. Flint lay nearby watching her work. Poor Thomas stood on the porch and watched her. She worked steadily, methodically, breaking up the hard-packed earth and pulling out rocks and dead roots. When she had a section cleared, she sat back on her heels and looked at it with satisfaction. The next day, he left a shovel and a hoe leaning against the back wall of the house. He said nothing about it. But when he came in that evening, the patch was twice as large, and she had blisters on her hands from the work. 4. He wanted to tell her to stop, that she didn't need to work that hard, but he didn't know how to say it in a way she'd understand. So instead, he went to the barn and found a pair of his old work gloves. They were too big for her, but they'd protect her hands. He left them on the kitchen table. In the morning, they were gone. 2 weeks after she'd arrived, Thomas rode into town for supplies. He didn't want to go. He wanted to stay at the ranch where things were simple and quiet, and there was hot food waiting when he came in from the fields. But he was out of coffee and low on flour, and he needed nails for the barn roof. Paragraph 4. He left early and rode fast and kept his head down when he got to town. He tied Ash outside the general store and went in to get what he needed. The storekeeper, a man named Patterson, looked up when the bell rang. "Garrett, haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy." Thomas set his list on the counter. Patterson read it over and started pulling items from the shelves. "Heard you got yourself some company out at your place." Paragraph 4. Thomas went very still. "Where'd you hear that?" Paragraph. "Jenkins saw smoke from your chimney when he was riding the East Range. Said it looked like you were burning a lot of wood for a man living alone." Patterson's tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp. "Said he saw laundry on a line, too. Women's clothes." Paragraph 4. Thomas didn't answer. He just stood there waiting for Patterson to finish filling his order. "That Mexican woman who came through a few weeks back." Patterson set a bag of flour on the counter with more force than necessary. "Some of the boys said she was asking for work. Said she didn't belong here. Figured she'd moved on by now. Or if she needed help." Thomas kept his voice level. "I gave her a place to stay for a while." Patterson leaned across the counter. "You know what people are going to say, don't you? A woman like that, alone with you out there." Warner, "I don't care what people say." Warner, "You should. There's talk, Garrett. There's men in this town who don't like the idea of a Mexican woman taking up space that could go to a proper Christian woman. And they especially don't like the idea of her living out at your ranch, like she's got some kind of claim to it." Sections Thomas met Patterson's eyes. "She's not taking anything from anyone. She's working for her keep, and when she's ready to move on, she'll move on. Until then, she's under my roof and my protection. Anyone has a problem with that. They can bring it to me directly." Sections. He paid for his supplies and loaded them onto Ash and rode out of town without looking back. But Patterson's words followed him. "There's talk." He'd known there would be. He'd known from the moment he let her stay that people would have opinions about it. He just hadn't cared enough to let it stop him. But now, riding back toward the ranch with the sun high and hot overhead, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Not in letting her stay. He didn't regret that. But in thinking that his protection would be enough. He was one man. If the town decided they wanted her gone, there wasn't much he could do to stop them. He was still thinking about it when he rode into his yard and saw her kneeling in her garden. She'd planted something. He could see the neat rows of disturbed earth and small green shoots just beginning to emerge. She looked up when she heard Ash's hooves and stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Packer." Thomas dismounted and started unloading supplies. She came over to help, and he let her, handing her the lighter bags while he took the flour and the nails. They worked in silence, carrying everything into the house and putting it away. When they were done, she poured him a cup of water from the pitcher on the counter, and he drank it, standing by the window, looking out at her garden. "You planted something," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but needing to say them anyway. Far. She came to stand beside him and looked out at the garden too. She pointed at the rows and held up fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 different things planted. Then she made a gesture like something growing tall and spreading wide, and she smiled. Paardegrover. Vegetables, Thomas said. You planted vegetables. Paardegrover. She nodded. Then she pointed at him, and then at herself, and made a gesture that encompassed the whole house, the whole ranch. Together. She was saying they'd eat from the garden together. Thomas felt something crack open in his chest. She was planning to stay long enough to harvest a garden. She was planning a future here, even if it was just a few months. She wasn't just passing through. She was putting down roots. I went to town today, he said quietly. There's talk about you being here, about us. It's not good talk. She looked at him, and he saw that she understood, even if she didn't know the specific words. She'd heard talk before. She knew what men said about women like her. Sections, if they come here, Thomas said, and he turned to face her fully. If anyone comes here and tries to make you leave, or tries to hurt you, I won't let them. You understand. You're under my protection now. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something she'd never done before. She reached out and touched his arm, just briefly, her hand light on his sleeve. Then she nodded and went back to the stove to start dinner. Pierre. Thomas stood by the window and watched her work, and tried to remember the last time anyone had touched him with gentleness. He couldn't. That night after dinner, they sat by the fire like they did most evenings now. Thomas mended a bridle, and she worked on a piece of cloth, embroidering a pattern of flowers along the edge with thread she'd pulled from an old shirt. Flint lay between them, his head on Thomas's boot, his tail occasionally thumping against the floor when she spoke softly to him in Spanish. Sections. The fire crackled and popped, and the room was warm, and Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Just simple, quiet peace. Sections. And then she started to sing. Sections. It was soft at first, barely more than a hum, but then the words came. Spanish words in a melody that was both sad and beautiful. Her voice was clear and sweet, and it filled the small room with something that made Thomas's chest ache. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. Loss, longing, hope, all of it woven together in a song that felt like a prayer. Freitauer. When she finished, she looked up and saw him watching her. She ducked her head, embarrassed, but he shook his head. Don't stop, he said. Please. She looked at him, and something passed between them, some understanding that went deeper than language. She started another song, seemed slower this time, and Thomas sat very still and listened and felt something in him that had been frozen for 6 years begin, very slowly, to thaw. Sections. 3 weeks after she'd arrived, Thomas was working on the barn roof when he heard horses. Multiple horses coming fast. He climbed down the ladder and walked to the front of the house, his hand resting on the hammer in his belt. Section's 5 men rode into his yard. Thomas recognized all of them. Patterson from the store. Jenkins, who owned the ranch to the east. 3 others who spent most of their time drinking at the saloon and making noise about politics and foreigners and the proper order of things. For the woman must have heard them too, because she appeared in the doorway of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Flint stood beside her, his ears forward and his body tense. Sections. Patterson reined his horse to a stop and looked from Thomas to the woman and back again. Garrett, we need to talk. Sections. So talk. Sections. Not out here. This is a private matter. Paragraph 4. Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of her? Paragraph 4. Patterson's mouth tightened. Fine. We're here about the Mexican woman. She needs to leave. Why? Because she doesn't belong here. Because she's taking up space and resources that should go to American citizens. Because it's not proper for her to be living here with you like this. Sections. Thomas looked at each man in turn. She's not taking anything from anyone. She works for her keep. And what's proper or not proper in my house is my business, not yours. Sections. Jenkins spoke up. There's laws, Garrett. Laws about harboring foreigners. Laws about what's decent and what's not. Sections. Show me the law that says I can't offer shelter to someone who needs it. Sections. It's not about the letter of the law, Patterson said. It's about what's right. That woman is a drain on this community. She's not one of us. And you keeping her here, treating her like she's got some kind of right to stay, it sends the wrong message. Sections. Thomas felt a cold anger settle in his gut. The only message I'm sending is that I won't turn away someone in need. If that bothers you, that's your problem, not mine. Sections. One of the saloon men, a big fellow named Dutch, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. You're making a fool of yourself, Garrett. Everyone knows what's really going on here. You got yourself a whore, and you're pretending it's charity. Sections. Thomas moved before he thought about it. He crossed the yard in 3 strides and grabbed Dutch by his shirt and hauled him off his horse. The man hit the ground hard, and Thomas stood over him. You say one more word about her, and I'll break your jaw. Dutch scrambled backward, and the other men tensed. Patterson held up a hand. Easy, Garrett. We didn't come here for a fight. 4. Then what did you come here for? 4. We came to give you a choice. Send her away today, and there's no problem. Keep her here, and we'll make sure the sheriff knows you're harboring an illegal immigrant. We'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are. Sections. Thomas looked at Patterson and saw the calculation in his eyes. This wasn't about the law or decency or community standards. This was about power. About a group of men who didn't like that Thomas Garrett, who kept to himself and asked nothing of anyone, had made a choice they didn't approve of. Sections. He turned and looked at the woman standing in his doorway. She was watching the scene with those steady dark eyes, her hand on Flint's head. She didn't look afraid. She looked ready. Ready to run if she had to. Ready to fight if she could. Ready to accept whatever came next. Sections. And Thomas realized in that moment that he couldn't let her go. Not because he needed her cooking, or her cleaning, or her company, though he'd come to value all of those things, but because sending her away to satisfy these men would be the same as admitting they were right, that she didn't belong, that she wasn't worth protecting, and he couldn't do that. Sections. She stays, Thomas said. He said it quietly, but every man in the yard heard him. Sections. Patterson's face hardened. You're making a mistake. Paragraph. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Paragraph. We'll be back, Garrett, and next time we'll bring the sheriff. Paragraph. You do that, and I'll tell the sheriff about how you boys ran a woman out of town for the crime of asking for work. I'll tell him about how you threatened a man on his own property for offering shelter to someone in need. We'll see whose story he believes. Sections. The men sat on their horses for a long moment, and Thomas could see them weighing their options. Finally, Patterson turned his horse. This isn't over. Pro. Yes, it is. Thomas's voice was flat. You came here to scare me into doing what you want. It didn't work. Now get off my land." They rode out slowly, making sure Thomas saw they weren't running. But they rode out. No, Thomas stood in his yard and watched them until they were out of sight, and then he turned and walked back to the house. Pargra. The woman was still standing in the doorway. As he got closer, she stepped aside to let him in, and then she closed the door behind him. Her hands were shaking. Before Thomas saw the shake and something in him broke. He reached out and took her hands in his, stilling them. Her hands were small and rough and warm, and they fit in his like they belonged there. "I meant what I said out there," he told her, even though he knew she probably couldn't understand most of it. "You stay as long as you want. No one is going to make you leave. I promise you that." For she looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with tears that she wouldn't let fall. And then she spoke. "Thank you." The words were heavily accented and soft, but they were clear. English words. The first English words she'd spoken to him. Thomas stared at her. "You speak English?" "Little," she said carefully. "I learn. I listen you. I learn little." "How long have you been learning?" She held up 2 fingers and pointed at the weeks that had passed. 2 weeks. She'd been listening to him talk to himself, to the dog, to the horse, and she'd been learning. "Berwar, what's your name?" The question came out rough. "I never asked your name." "Bermor, Maria," she said. "My name Maria. Bermor, Maria." He said it carefully, trying to get the pronunciation right. "I'm Thomas." "Bermor, Thomas." She smiled just a little. "I know. I hear you say when you talk to horse." He was still holding her hands, and he realized it and started to let go, but she held on, just for a second longer, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You good man," she said quietly. "You protect me. No man protect me before. Only mio sposo, my husband. He gone now. But you protect me. Thank you." "Per. Thomas felt his throat tighten. "You don't have to thank me. It's just what's right." "Per. Many men know what right. Few men do what right." She squeezed his hands once, and then let go and stepped back. "I make dinner now. You hungry?" "Per. Yeah," Thomas said. "Yeah, I'm hungry." "Per." He watched her move to the stove and start pulling out pots and ingredients, and he thought about what she'd said. Few men do what right. He'd never thought of himself as particularly good or particularly brave. He just did what needed doing. But maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all it took. Sections. That night after dinner, Maria brought out her embroidery again, but this time, instead of working in silence, she started to talk. Her English was halting and broken, but she pushed through, determined to be understood. She told him about her village in Mexico, about the church where she'd married her husband, about the little house they'd shared. She told him about the fever that had taken her husband and her daughter within days of each other. She told him about the journey north, looking for work, looking for a new life, looking for anything that wasn't the emptiness of her village without her family in it. Perdebrar. Thomas listened and asked questions when she paused, and slowly, piece by piece, he learned her story. And then, because it seemed only fair, he told her his sections. He told her about his wife, Sarah, who'd died in childbirth 6 years ago, along with the son they'd been expecting. He told her about the months after, when he'd kept working because work was the only thing that made sense, and how the work had eventually swallowed everything else until there was nothing left but the routine of survival. He told her about the silence and the loneliness, and how he'd convinced himself he preferred it that way. Power. But then you came here, he said, and you filled my house with cooking smells, and you planted a garden, and you made everything different. And I realized I didn't want the silence anymore. Power. Maria looked at him across the firelight. You want me stay? Power, yes. The word came out without hesitation. Yes, I want you to stay. Power. They come back. The men. Why, they make trouble. Sections. Let them. I meant what I said. You're under my protection now. Sections. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something in Spanish, soft and quick. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Relief. Gratitude. Hope. Powerful. What did you say? Powerful. She smiled. I say I stay. I stay and I make garden grow, and I cook for you, and I make this house a home again, if you let me. Powerful. I'd like that, Thomas said, and he realized as he said it that it was the truest thing he'd said in 6 years. Powerful. The weeks passed and turned into months. The garden grew, and Maria harvested vegetables that Thomas had never tasted before, peppers and tomatillos and herbs with names he couldn't pronounce, and she taught him words in Spanish, and he taught her more English, and slowly they built a language between them that was part English and part Spanish, and part something that existed only in the space they shared. Sections. The men from town didn't come back, but Thomas heard the talk when he went in for supplies. He heard the whispers and the speculation and the crude jokes. He ignored all of it. Let them talk. He had a warm house and good food, and a woman who sang while she worked, and a future that looked like something other than an endless repetition of empty days. Sections. In November, the first snow came, and Thomas woke to find Maria already up, standing at the window and watching the white flakes fall. She turned when she heard him move, and her face was bright with wonder. "Farter snow," she said. "In my village, no snow. Ye never. You've never seen snow before." She shook her head. "Never." Thomas got up and pulled on his coat and his boots and held out his hand. "Come on." She looked at him, confused, but she took his hand and let him lead her outside. The snow was falling thick and soft, covering the yard and the roof and the fence posts in white. Maria stepped off the porch and into it and laughed, a sound of pure delight that Thomas hadn't heard from her before. She tilted her face up to the sky and closed her eyes and let the snowflakes land on her cheeks and her eyelashes. Poorer. Thomas stood on the porch and watched her and felt something settle in his chest. This was right. This woman, this moment, this life they were building together. It was right in a way nothing had been right for 6 years, like sections. Maria turned and looked at him, and her smile faded into something more serious. She walked back to the porch and climbed the steps until she was standing in front of him, close enough that he could see the snowflakes melting in her hair. "Thomas," she said softly, "I need tell you something." "What is it?" "I love this place. I love this house. I love the garden and the work and the quiet." She paused. "I love you." The words hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, and she looked back at him steadily, waiting. "Maria, you no have to say back," she said quickly. "I just need you know. You save me. You give me home when I have nothing. You protect me when no one else would. You good man, Thomas Garrett. And I love you." Bervar. Thomas reached out and took her face in his hands, his rough palms gentle against her cheeks. "I love you too," he said, and the words felt like a confession and a benediction all at once. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again, but I do. I love you, Maria." She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out. And then she kissed him, soft and brief and sweet, and he kissed her back, and the snow fell around them, and the world was quiet and perfect. Far, They were married in the spring by a traveling preacher who came through once a year to perform weddings and baptisms for the scattered ranches. Thomas wore his one good suit, and Maria wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric he'd bought her in town, pale blue with white embroidery at the collar and cuffs. The Flint sat at their feet during the ceremony, and the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Thomas kissed his bride under the open sky, with the mountains watching. Paragraph 4. That night they had a wedding dinner of all Maria's best dishes, and they sat at their table and ate and talked and laughed, and when the meal was done, Thomas took her hand and led her to the bed they would share from now on. The next morning, Thomas woke to the smell of coffee and cooking, and he lay there for a moment, just breathing it in. Then he got up and went to the kitchen, and found Maria at the stove, humming softly to herself, and he wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on top of her head. "Good morning, Mrs. Garrett," he said. She turned in his arms and smiled up at him. "Good morning, husband." And Thomas Garrett, who had spent 6 years in silence and solitude, who had convinced himself that he was content with an empty house and an empty heart, looked at his wife and his home and his future and felt a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. Paragraph. She had come to him out of the wilderness, a stranger who spoke a different language and carried the grief of a shattered life. And she had taken his broken house and made it whole. She had taken his frozen heart and brought it back to life. She had given him a reason to care about something other than survival. And all it had taken was the smell of cooking, the sound of singing, and the courage to do what was right even when the world said it was wrong. Thank you for listening to this story. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is open our door to someone in need and trust that kindness will find its way back to us. If this story touched you, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever taken a chance on someone when everyone else said you shouldn't? I'd love to hear your story. I'll see you in the next one.